Well, when I started, I did my PhD research here in Bangalore, and I spent 2 years working with the Bangalore Water Supply and Sewerage Board. And I did a lot of really urban, utility-focused, institutional development type work, and very much focusing on the pro-poor elements and on policy. And then when I joined the World Bank, in 2006 as staff. I had been working on and off with them as a consultant. And I worked for about a year in China and Indonesia, again in the similar space. So it was really interesting to move my expertise and my limited expertise, growing expertise to a different region. But then I moved back to India, but to Delhi in 2007. And I started working on a different subject. I started working on international rivers and river basins, on the Indus, on the Ganges, on the Brahmaputra, and thinking about the role of cities within what we're talking about today, within the context of regional development and in the context of basin planning and the basin lens. And through that, we did various pieces of work. We started something called the South Asia Water Initiative, which is an initiative to focus on research and investment preparation in all the rivers that originate from the Greater Himalayas. And we've had 2 phases of that. And most importantly, from my personal point of view, in the last 4 years, we've been working on what the bank calls the National Ganga River Basin Project, which is now a large loan. It's been active for about 2 years to the government of India to effectively fund a Ganga cleanup project. And it's the new incarnation of the old Ganga Action Plan, or GAP 1 and GAP 2. So that's what I'm working on now, based in Delhi, but working in the 5 states through which the main stem of the river runs, and working with all the cities and the equivalents of utilities, if you want to call it that, in those main cities. Well, I think sometimes the gap gets a very bad rap, sometimes for reasons that are not necessarily either correct. There's a lot of misperception in the media. I think the main thing with the Ganga Action Plan is that not very much money was spent. Whenever you read about Ganga Action Plan in the press, the first thing you read is that crores and crores of rupees was spent and gone down the drain and nothing's functioning. First of all, not a lot of money was spent perhaps relative to what India was ready to spend on an environmental public good, but the cost per kilometer, or the investment per kilometer for a 2,500 kilometer river, was actually peanuts relative to what it's taken in other parts of the world to achieve river cleanup. So I think that dimension has to be taken into consideration. And secondly, I think the choice of investments is something that many people have objected to. Whether it's the centralized system of sewerage or a heavy focus on typical centralized STPs rather than small-scale decentralized sewage treatment plants, or even off-network local sanitation options, on-site sanitation options. So I think those are maybe more valid criticisms. And I think that ties back to the main constraint in urban India today, which is very weak capacity in cities and very weak capacity specifically of water and wastewater utilities. Bangalore, where we are now, is an exception. Hyderabad, Chennai, those are exceptions. But in most parts of urban India, particularly in the Gangetic belt, you have very weak utilities, if they exist at all, and also pretty weak cities in most cases with little financial capacity to manage. So a lot of the criticisms about the Ganga Action Plan, past and present, have been about asset sustainability. What we're really trying to look at is the sustainability dimension. So we're trying to address that through various measures. One of the measures is a mandatory requirement that all households have to connect to the sewer networks. Now, we can't enforce that. Neither can the bank, neither can the central government, neither can the state government. This is a city prerogative. But you can advise that and work with that and have very strong social mobilization components. All of our successful projects, for example, 24/7 water supply and Hubli Dharwad, have very strong social mobilization components in which that's how you really rally households to connect to the network. You also address it through assurance of pro-poor policies that set the right measures, set the right connection charges, set the right tariff structure, and all of that goes hand in glove with regulation so that you incentivize households to get onto the network. The other thing we're doing, though, which we can control, is mandating that secondary lines be laid in all the streets. Prior to that, you could look at a map, for example, of a city, and you would see large pockets of unsewered portions of the city in which ostensibly nobody was there. But then you would walk and visit those areas, and it was huge portions of the city were actually very densely populated slums, many of which have been there 30, 40 years. And when you're talking about 30, 40% of the population living in those conditions, you have to connect them with sewers. Now, with that goes a whole set of challenges as how does a utility service those areas and all the things we've talked about before. But we're trying to mandate that. And maybe the last thing I'll just touch on now in terms of sustainability is mandating 10-year DBOs, design, build, operate contracts for all large infrastructure investments. So that means that the private operator is incentivized to stay in the contract and to maintain the asset for at least the life of 10 years. 5 of that is funded through the centrally sponsored scheme, 70% from central government, 30% from the state. But the private contractor is obligated, and the contract is structured in such a way that they stay on for 10 years. So you avoid the problem of the hit and run. You just build and then you walk away. Asset is transferred from the state to the city, and there are no funds and no interest in maintaining the asset going forward, which is something that happened to some of the investments funded under GAP 1 and 2. Well, I think I touched on the main one to me, which is really weak management. Not necessarily for lack of skills, sometimes for lack of skills, but often for lack of power and lack of delegated decision-making powers at the level which counts, namely the city. You often read in the press that, or if you talk to your friends about what you work on, they say, oh, it must be about water shortage, water wars, we read in the paper. I really don't think it's an issue at the moment. Now, water is scarce. We're sitting in a city where water scarcity is a very big issue. Kaveri River is 100 kilometers away. But in other cities, it's not as big an issue. Liters per capita per day availability are quite high relative to cities, for example, in the US, where I come from. And it's really a matter of how you manage that resource. What are you doing to improve unaccounted for water, reduce that figure from the 40 or 50%, which it is now? What are you doing to improve water efficiency? The other thing that pricing, I mean, all these issues, the other thing that all over the world, when people work on water, the disproportionate attention is on water and not on wastewater. And I think 12th plan is trying to address this with a policy encouragement, if you will, to work on wastewater in conjunction with water whenever you plan a new supply structure, a new scheme. But for the most part, we have large cities, for example, Patna, where you have no sewage system, so to speak. And you have millions of people living with no sewer network whatsoever. And you have plenty other cities, including my city, New York City, where you have very old sewers from 100 years. And if you don't have a wastewater department or utility or mandate in addition to your water supply, you have a very uneven and very problematic. And you combine that with highly seasonal flows in India, lots of a monsoon season that's incredibly sharp and incredibly strong, and you have a recipe for flooding and disaster and poor sanitation. I think your clear and obvious strength is education and educating young people. India doesn't have a corpus of graduates from public policy type institutions or urban planning type institutions the way all the other countries I've lived in, and there are many, be it Singapore, be it Holland, be it the US, be it France, be it Italy. I have never seen, and this country is a large country, so few people interested in that space, or even if they are interested, unsure of where to go. Where do I go to get trained? And if I am trained, then what do I do with that? The primary recruits into government are through an elite Indian administrative service that's really not open to everybody. It's incredibly competitive. And then, like I was saying before, cities don't have the structures that create a whole recruit. I went to Columbia University in New York long before I was interested in urban planning or international development. And many, many of my peers graduated and went to work in city government. Working for the Parks Department was considered a prestigious job after graduating. I can't imagine the equivalent today in India. But I think that will change slowly as more and more people are interested in policy and governance. And I really think that's where IIHS can make a huge difference in educating people to have the professional interest and skills to take on those positions. And then also working with government to create the space so that there is a sufficient supply for the jobs that will be demanded as your graduates come out of the system. I think you're doing all the right things. I mean, from what I know, which is not very deep, but from what I know, I think you're doing all the right things. You're touching in all the right space. You're focusing on mid-career and practitioners, keeping a very strong finger on the pulse of what's happening in the policy space, and not just in the education space in the future, but what's happening right now. I think mixing a bit of consulting with research, with advocacy is really important. And I think you're touching all the right sectors: transport, water, design, housing. So I think you'll find your way in that sense. I wish you the best of luck.